Alright, so in this video we're going to learn how to make a deck selector, how to use it to choose a class. So in my case, you see here an example. I have a couple class options, and if I click on one of them, I can confirm the selection. In this case I timed out, but I can confirm it, or I can just let it time out and it's still going to work. And it's going to set my player class to whatever the player selected. I can also reset the selection. For example, I can click on Spellcaster, and then if I click on Reset, it's just going to start it over. And this could be useful if you have some random variables or random selections that you want to give to the player. You can allow them to re-roll it, kind of similar to how it works in the Spiral Abyss. But yeah, you can see that if I choose Blade Master, I have 100 HP. But if I were to choose something like Archer, you can see here that I have 10,000 HP. So that kind of proves that the class selection is working. Because if we go ahead and look at the class here that I have Blade Master, which gives 100 HP, and then Archer gives 10,000. So that's how we can tell that it's working. I'm going to use the setup that I have now just to kind of save time. I'm going to go over what I have set up and what you need to do in order to make this work from scratch. So first of all, in my case, because I want the deck selector to select the class for the player, I have here 5 classes that I made, and each class has a configuration ID, and we're going to use this configuration ID, we're going to map it to the deck selector, so that when I click on, for example, the first option, which was the Blade Master class on the deck selector, when I click on that, it's going to use this configuration ID and set the player's class to this, right? Same thing for Archer, it'll use this configuration ID. Now, how I currently have it set up, the mapping between the deck selection and the class, is on the player, I created a custom variable, made it a dictionary, and here I just literally map it out. The first one is going to go to the Blade Master configuration ID. The second one is going to go to the Archer. So whenever I select a card in the deck selection with one of these values, it's going to map to this one. If you don't know how dictionaries work, I'm going to make a video on that very soon. If you don't want to use a dictionary or you don't know how, you can just manually check each deck selection index and then assign it a class ID in a node graph. But in my case, I'm just showing you how I'm doing it in case you want to follow along. Alright, so let's go over how to make a deck selection. If you go into Manage UI Control Groups, and you go into UI Control Group Library, you can't actually make it in the interface. This kind of exists as a UI element, but it's not on the UI actively. You kind of have to activate it yourself using node graph logic. You go into UI Control Group Library, and in here, I already have one pre-made. This is the one you saw at the start of the video. You can go on the bottom here where it says Add UI Control Template. You can select whichever one you're working with, in our case deck selector. I'm just going to hide the one that I have, and if you click on deck selector, you're going to see that it shows up. It's just blank, there's nothing to it, and you can see on the right side there aren't many options. You actually have to open it and go to the panel that is within it, and now we have a lot of options, and this is where we can specify all sorts of different variables and all the cards that are going to be displayed. So let's start from the top. The transform you can't really edit, it just kind of takes up the whole screen. You don't have to worry about setting it for each device because it just kind of works. For layer, this just basically gives you the order of importance for UI elements. So if this is a layer of 1, it will go over something with a layer of 0 and vice versa. So if you have other UI components with a 0 layer value and you want this to always be on top, you can just set this to like, 2 or 3. If you want to just make sure it's always on top, you can set it to like 9999. You don't really have to get so desperate. You can just set it to 1 and make sure everything else is 0, but that's what that is. For visibility, this one is actually very misleading. This doesn't mean that your deck selector will be initially displayed when the game starts. How the deck selector works is that it exists, but it's initially turned off. Like it exists as a UI control group, but you have to manually enable it through the node graph in order for it to actually be visible to the player. What initially visible means is that when you activate it, is it going to be visible, or do you want to control the visibility yourself manually through the node graph? Okay, so if I have this off and I enable it in the node graph, it will enable itself, but it's not going to show to the player. Okay, so you generally want to keep this on unless you have some really specific case for it. In the deck selector settings, you have the display title option. If you want to hint to what the deck selector is or give it a title, you can, show it. The text goes here. So in my case, I'm going to say like choose a class. You can see it updates here. The interface layout, you have two different options. You can make it a list or you can make it a grid. Show selected quantity, so if I click on 2 cards, it'll show that I selected 2 of them. You could keep this on or off, it's not super important. Show the reset count limit. If you allow the character to reset or kind of like refresh the selected options, if for example you're working with random deck selections similar to the Abyss, you can allow them to reset it up to a certain amount of time, and you can show the reset count limit for the player so that they know how many times they can reset their selections. For show remaining time, this only works if you actually set a time limit for the deck selection. You can choose to have it so that the player has to close out of here, or you can do it based on time. So if this is a single player game that you're making, you don't have to set a time, but if this is a multiplayer thing and you don't want everyone to wait until everyone chooses, you kind of want to just force it, you could set a time and then you can show it, or you don't have to show it, right? That's up to you. Pre-end warning time. So I believe this is the time that the timer starts flashing red, so that it kind of gives the player a hint that it's about to end, that the deck selector is about to expire. You can set this to whatever you want. I think 10 is a pretty good value. If you are making this for a single player game, you can pause the game when it shows up so that you're not rushing the player and so that other things around the player don't happen. Controls can collapse. This is basically this button right here. Is the player able to collapse the selections and then open it up later? In my case, I don't want this enabled because I want to force the player to choose a class, so I'm going to disable this. And can the selection be cancelled? Again, I want to make sure that the player chooses something, so I'm not going to allow this. Now, as far as setting how many times the player can reset the selection, I don't see an option here. I don't think it's something that you can configure within the editor. I'm pretty sure this is something that you have to configure in the node graph yourself and set it in the node that calls a deck selector, which we'll go over soon. And so what you can do is not allow the players to reset their selection by giving it a value of 0. So 0 times they can reset. We're going to go over that in a second. In the option configuration settings, if you want to keep it mysterious and you don't want to show the player what they're clicking on, then you can disable the icons or the titles or the descriptions of the cards. You can also reveal the result after they selected it, or if you want to keep it hidden still, like it doesn't really matter if they see it or they don't, you can turn this off. So how this would work is they would click on an unknown card and then it would be revealed, like all of these things here that you disabled, it would then be revealed. In my case, I don't really have any need for this. I want the player to see what they're choosing, so I'm going to keep all this on. And then here you can choose how you want the deck selector to finish. Do you want the player to close it manually, or do you want it to happen after some time? So in my case, I'm setting the countdown to 10 seconds. And since the pre-end warning time is 10 seconds, it's basically just going to immediately start flashing the red time. And now to actually add something to the deck, if we go into the deck list here and edit details, you can see that we have this deck library content, and it's here that we can add the different options in our deck selector. So if we go ahead and click on new row, let's do that like 3 times. Or actually, let's do it 5 times because I'm doing 5 classes, right? This is just an example. So in here, you can specify if this is an unknown deck or a known deck, if it's like hidden from the player or not. In my case, it's going to be known. If you click unknown, it's just going to be question marked. You know, everything's going to be question marked. So in my case, I'm just going to keep everything to known. For the deck icon, there's not really that many options, but in my case, it kind of works out because all I need here are the weapon items to match the class descriptions. And in here you can add a deck title. So in my case, I would put the name of the classes. So I would put like Blade Master here, Archer here, and so on. Description is up to you. If you have some kind of variable stored somewhere that you want to reference, you can click here, and then if there's something on the player or on the stage, so in my case, my player has like these variables on them, kill counter or whatever, so I could use this. You can probably make a custom string variable on a player and then have that displayed. But in my case, there's no need. I can just type in my own descriptions here. It doesn't really matter what I put in. You can give each card a color. There's a few options here. And then you can add tag descriptions. So this is actually not visible to the player. This is visible only to the creator, so that it's kind of like a note system, so you don't forget what the deck option is for. So this deck description is actually going to be seen by the player, and this is for the creator. It's for you. So I'm going to X out of here. These are really all the options. You can see here that we have the cards displaying. Just for example, I can pick different things here, and you'll see that the icons appear. However, if I click on unknown deck, you'll see that everything gets disabled and it gets set as this unknown deck. It's kind of different from everything else, right? It has its own unique unknown version. So this is kind of useful if you want to just let the player randomly select some kind of buff. Maybe they get like a random attack bonus or a defense bonus, and you just let them click and try their luck. So that's what this is mainly for. Now, in order to actually use this deck selector inside the node graph, you actually have to save it. So if you click on deck selector, this one, and you click on save as template, you can give it a name. So I'll just do test. And then you'll see that it appears in the custom template sections. So now you can actually reference this test template by referencing its index configuration ID here. Well, technically it's not a configuration ID. I believe this is just an integer, which is a little confusing because almost everything is a configuration ID in the editor, but for some reason indexes are integers. So it's kind of important for you to just remember that. But yeah, if I just add a deck selector, you can see that this deck selector doesn't have an index. You have to save it as a template, and then it's going to get assigned an index. So in my case, it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to use this because I already have a class selector here. So I'm just going to delete these, and we're just going to use this class selector in our node graph. I'm going to show you how this all works right now. Okay, so here we are in the node graph. I named it invoke class selector because that's what we're invoking. We're enabling the class selector. So it's broken up into two parts. We have when the entity is created, I'm going to invoke the class selector. And then when the deck selector is complete, specifically when it's refreshed. So I'm going to go over this in a second. I'm going to focus on the top part first, okay? So in my case, what I want is when the game starts, I want to enable this class selector, display it on screen, and have the player choose their class as soon as the game begins. You can set this to however you want, whatever event you want to trigger the class selector from displaying, it's up to you. You can choose it here. In my case, I'm just using when the entity is created, and I'm putting this node graph on the player so that when the player is created, which is always going to be at the start of the game, then it's going to run this logic and create the class selector. So we're going to go over this right now. So when the entity is created, the event source entity, which is going to be what this node graph is attached to, so in my case it's the player, I'm just going to make sure that it is the player by getting the entity type and checking that it is the player within enumerations equal, and I'm going to pass the result into the double branch. So if the entity is actually a player, then I'm going to invoke the class selector. Now in this case, the invoke class selector node here is a composite node. I'm going to make a video on this in the future, but basically if I click into it, you'll see that all it does is it calls this invoke deck selector node. That's all it does. The reason that I made a composite node for it is because I specified the deck selector index, which the one that I put in here is for the class selector, right? It's the one that's in the UI control group. That's its index. Now this is a little beneficial because let's just say in case I delete the deck selector, the class selector that I have now, and I create a new one, it's going to make a new index. So instead of having to go to every single place where I would use this node, I could just go to this one composite node, change it in here, and then every other node graph that uses the composite node like this, it's going to automatically just use the value, the index value that I put in here. That's the only reason why I did this. But normally if you want to invoke the deck selector, you would use this invoke deck selector node. So let's go over what variables you need. You need the target player. You don't need the character, you need the player, right? Two separate entities. You need the index of the deck selector. Now again, just to remind everyone, when you go into the control group and you go on the template, this index value right here is the index for your deck selector, or any control group for that matter. Any custom template that you have here is going to have an index number. You can pass in a duration for how long you want this deck selector to last. If you don't, it's going to use the default value that you put in the UI control group creation screen when we initially made the deck selector. Now we have two confusing list inputs here. We have the select result corresponding list and select display corresponding list. How it works is you put your options that you want to display here in the select display list, and then you pass in a list that will map to the display list, and it will return a value based on which item on the display you clicked. So that's a little confusing, so let's go over an example. So you can see here that what I passed in is I made a list using assembly list. Now assembly list creates a new list every time the node graph runs. It creates a new list. The first item in the list has a value of 1, the second item in the list has a value of 2, and so forth until 5. lists are 0 indexed, which means the first item is going to have an index of 0 and the second item is going to have an index of 1, but that's not really important now. Just know that the first item is here, the second item is here, and I give it a value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So what's going to happen is I'm going to pass in this into the display. So it's going to display the dex with the value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we go into the dex selector in the UI control group, you see here that the deck ID is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it correlates to these classes, right? So 1 is Blade Master, 2 is Archer. So in here, what's going to happen is I'm passing in this list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 into here. So it's going to display 1, which is Blade Master, 2, which is Archer, right? And it's going to keep going. If I did this, for example, if I did 1, 2, 2, then the third item in the deck selector is also going to display Archer because Archer's index, deck index is 2. So I'm going to have 1, 2, 2, which is going to be Blade Master, Archer, Archer. So this is how it works. You're passing in the deck indexes that you want to display. Now for the select result, you typically want this to be the same as your display so that when you click on 1, you're going to get a value of 1. You're going to get that deck ID. But let's say, for example, you were doing some kind of custom logic, you know, for whatever reason you want to do this. Maybe you're just trying to troll your players. I can't really think of a good reason, but if I were to change the first element to, for example, 5, and then I go 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's say I pass this into the result corresponding list. So what's going to happen is the display is going to display the first deck ID, the second deck ID, but then when I click on the first deck ID, which is supposed to be Blade Master, I'm actually going to get a value of 5, which is the last class, which I believe is Trickster in my case. So it's basically a map, right? It's the whatever comes in first in the display is going to get mapped to whatever comes in first in the result. So when I click on the first deck ID or the first selection, it's going to give me the first result in this list. If I click on the second one, it's going to give me not 2, it's going to give me 4. So you can kind of control what the result is based on what deck ID you click on. Now again, you usually want this to be the same so that when you click on number 1, you get number 1. When you click on number 2, you get number 2. So in my case, I'm going to delete this. I'm going to go back to how it was and pass it into both here. And then we have select minimum quantity. So if you want the player to choose more than one value, then you can set this to 2, 3, 4, whatever. In my case, because I want the player to choose a class and they can't set more than one class to themselves, I'm just going to put 1 here, which is only going to allow them to pick one thing. And same thing with the maximum. If you want to allow your players to select up to a certain amount of values or a certain amount of selections, then you can choose a higher value than 1. You could do whatever, right? So in my case, I only want them to pick one value, so I'm going to put 1 and 1. For refresh mode, this is very important because it works a particular way. You can set here the refresh minimum quantity and maximum quantity in order for you to be allowed to refresh. So what this means is I have to choose one item if I want to refresh with a maximum of 2 items. If I choose 3, I can't refresh. But if I choose 2, then I can refresh. And then if I do partial refresh, it's going to listen to this rule that I have. However, if I choose refresh all, it's going to actually ignore these rules. It's just going to refresh everything. It's not going to care how many I'm selecting. These rules don't apply. If I don't want to be able to refresh at all, I can click on cannot refresh, and then the refresh button or the reset button is not going to show up. And then lastly, you have default return selection. Now how this works is you pass in a list. The length of this list has to match what you put for minimum and maximum quantity that the player can select. So if the maximum in my case is 1, then I cannot pass in a list that has 2 items in it because they should only be able to pick 1. If my minimum is 1 and my maximum is 5, then I can give it a list that has 2 things, 3 things, 4 things, or 5 things in it, that's fine. But if I give it 6 things in the list, it's not going to work because I can only go up to 5. And if the list is empty, that's also not going to work because my minimum is at 1. You have to make sure that whatever you're passing in here follows the rules that you're setting. And so that's what this part of the node graph does. When the entity is created, we invoke the class selector. So one thing to understand is that the deck selector exists in the game, but it's not turned on. You have to enable it, you have to invoke it in order for the player to see it. It's kind of like a prefab, right? You have a prefab, but you can only see the prefab when you instantiate it in the scene. So it's very similar. You have the prefab of the deck selection, but you can only see it once you invoke it. Now, down here at the bottom portion, we have when deck selector is complete node. This is an event node that fires when you do something with the deck selector. So this is kind of interesting because when you refresh the deck selector, whether it's a fixed quantity refresh or a refresh all, it counts as the deck selector being completed. So depending on what kind of completion reason that this event returns, you want to run different logic. If the user is refreshing their list, you obviously don't want to consider that as their selection. You want to just refresh the list and you want to invoke it again. You want to invoke the deck selection again. So this is what I'm doing here in this check. I know I don't have it enabled, but for the sake of the tutorial, I'm just showing you how you would do this. So if the type is fixed quantity refresh or refresh all, depending on what you set in the invoke node, then you can check for that. And if the user refreshed, then you can just kind of do this logic again where you invoke the class selector. In my case, I'm checking the deck selector index. I'm making sure that this is the class selector. You can see I even put a note here. This is the index ID of the class selector. So if I'm refreshing the class selector, if both of these are true, I'm checking that with an AND operation, then I'm going to move into the double branch and I'm going to invoke a class selector the same way that I did it up here initially. Every single time that they refresh, this is going to get called and it's going to do this check to make sure that it's only going to run when the player refreshes, okay? And if the player refreshes, we'll just invoke it again. Now the issue here is that if I do want to invoke it again, I'm passing in the same values, right? Typically, if you want to allow the player to refresh your deck selection, it's because you aren't showing all the options. You're kind of randomizing, let's say like 3 out of 6 possibilities. And so when the player refreshes, you want to give them another 3 random selections. And so in this case, I just kind of made something really quickly. If this is the case, if you only want to, for example, have 3 random selections put into the class selector on refresh, what you can do is you can make your assembly list, assign it to a local variable, and then you can use a random deck selector selection list node. What this does is it basically just shuffles around the list. So I'm going to pass this list into a local variable. The reason I do this is because, again, whenever I use an assembly list, it's going to remake the list each time. So if I pass this list into the select list, it's going to randomize it, it's going to shuffle it, but then when you're going to pass it into the iteration list afterwards, it's going to assemble it again. So the list gets unshuffled. It goes back to its regular state. The random deck selector node doesn't output the shuffled list. It just shuffles the list in place. It just shuffles it in the moment. If I were to just pass this list into the iteration list, it's going to assemble it again, and I'm going to get my ordered list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that's why you have to assign it to a local variable and then pass the local variable into the randomizer and then use the local variable into the list iteration loop, because the local variable is going to remember its new values. It's not an assembly list. It's not going to remake the list. It's not going to reassemble itself. So with the random list, with the shuffled list, I should say, I'm going to create a new local variable with the same integer list type, and I'm going to pass in this iteration value into the insert value. So this insert value into list, it takes in a list. So in my case, this local variable that I created, I'm passing it into here as the list. I'm inserting the value of whatever it's taking in, whatever it's iterating over in this shuffled list. And it's asking me the insert ID, which is the index of where I'm putting in the value, right? So if you think of list as the first element, the second element, the third element, this is asking where to put it, the second, the third, the fourth. In this case, if I just get the list length, for example, let's say there are 2 items in the list. This get list length is going to get the value of 2 because there's 2 things in the list. And then I'm going to put that 2 inside the insert ID. So that's where I'm putting it. I'm putting it in the second index. Now the reason this works is because lists are 0 indexed. So the first thing in the list actually has an index of 0. And the second thing in the list has an index of 1. So if I have 2 things in the list and I get a value of 2 because that's the length, when I insert it and I pass 2 in here, it's creating a third item because the index of 2 is actually for the third item in the list. So this is just an easy way to insert values into a list. And then what I'm doing after every insert is I'm checking if the list length is 3. Now because I'm doing this after the insert value, I'm doing this as a check for the double branch. Because this double branch comes after this execution node, it's going to recalculate these variables. So I'm going to insert the value into the local variable, And then when I move on to here, this local variable is going to have that value added to it already. So it's going to have 3 items in the list, for example. And then I'm going to get the list length is going to return 3. And then I'll compare it to 3. And then if it's true, then we're going to run the double branch. And this connects to a break loop. Okay, because I want it to stop here. I want to make the list only have 3 values, for example, right? So then when I break the loop, I have to connect it into the list iteration loop in order to break it. This is kind of like an early exit. You use this node to pass it into this loop, and it's going to break at this point whenever this connection is made. So essentially, I'm iterating through 5 random values. I'm getting their values, I'm putting it into a list. And then when the list reaches a length of 3, when there are 3 items in the list, then I'm breaking the loop. And then I'm going to pass this value into my select result and display list. I'm not going to use a hard-coded 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 every time. So let's actually just get rid of this assembly list. And same thing with this default value that I have. I'm not going to choose a default value of 1. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the first value in this randomized list. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to move this up here for better readability. And I'm going to pass in this list value into the result and into the display. And then for the default return selection, I'm going to pick the first item in this random list. So I'm going to do this by getting a value from the list. I'm going to pass in the list here. And I'm going to get the first thing in that list. So remember the index of 0, because 0 maps to the first item in the list. And then I'm going to pass the value into the assembly list. So I'm going to create a list and pass the list into my invoke class selector, because this has to take a list. It can't just take the first value, which is going to be an integer. It has to be a list, just because it doesn't know if you only have 1 item or if you might have multiple items. So you kind of have to do it this way. And of course, I have to actually run this by connecting the double branch into the random deck selector selection list node, because right now it's not connected to anything. So I'm going to just select everything here. I'm going to move this all over, and I'm going to disconnect this link, connect it here to the random deck selector. And then when the loop completes, which is when we have our 3 random values, then we're going to invoke the class selector with all of our values made. And so there we go. I tried to kind of clean this up a little bit, so hopefully we'll see this work in action now. Okay, now if I click on reset selection, you'll see that we get 3 random values, and I can keep on resetting the selection, and 3 random values happen each time. Then I can actually confirm on something once I'm done, and there we go. And finally, in order for us to actually create the player class, I have here a node graph that has the same event when deck selector is complete, but it listens to completed by player and timeout. So these are the only choices where the player either chose something or they timed out and we got a default value. And again, I'm checking to make sure that we're checking the correct deck selector, which is the class selector. And if it's been completed by the player or it's been timed out, I kind of do a logical OR check, so one of these has to be true. And then I just make sure that this is true and this is true, that I'm working with the class selector. If both of these are true, then we move on to the double branch and we get our result. So here's our result, selection result list. These are all the things that were chosen when we confirm the selection, when the player confirms the selection. So it could be 1 or 2 things. In our case, it's only going to be 1 thing, which is the class. I'm going to get the corresponding value from the list. I'm going to get the first element, since there should only be 1 element. I'm going to get the first element by passing a 0 index. And then whatever value that is, let's say the result is 2, which is Archer. So I'm going to pass in 2. And I'm querying the dictionary that's on my player that I showed at the beginning of the video, the class deck ID to class. So if 2 comes in here on the player, if I go to the custom variables, if 2 is selected, it's going to get this dictionary, it's going to map it to this class, which is the class of the Archer. And so it's going to query that Archer configuration ID, and then we call this change player class node, which takes in a class config ID and the target player. Now the way that I test it is inside the game. If I choose on Blade Master, for example, this is how I'm testing it. If I go in my inventory and I try to select a bow, because my class is Blade Master, I can't select the bow. So that's just kind of the custom logic that I have built in. So this is how I'm testing to make sure that it works. Whereas if I try to equip my sword, then it's going to work. And you can see that the other effects that I have elsewhere in my code base are also being in effect because my class has been selected to Blade Master and I get certain effects. You can see that actually my abilities show up here where I can use the sword. However, if I choose Archer in here, and I click on confirm selection, you can see that all my skills are gone at the bottom, and now I can equip a bow, but I can't equip a sword. Okay, so that's just kind of my proof to you that it works. If you have any questions that pertain to your game specifically, leave them in the comments or join the Discord in the description, and I'll try to help you out as best as I can.